In the national conversation about guns, nothing seizes the attention of the public more effectively than mass shootings, otherwise known as multiple victim public shootings. The unimaginable horror and often random nature of these events strike fear into most people, specifically the idea that it could happen anytime, anywhere. No one wants to play a part in making these shootings easier to carry out, and no one is ignoring the tragic nature of these events. But if we want to prevent or mitigate these things, we need to be rational and honest about them. There's no room in this conversation for politics or disinformation. The number of mass shootings, or how often they can occur, can be misleading. What makes them misleading is how governments define them. Often it's a shooting that involves the death of 4 or more people. For tonight, we're going to ignore that number because it excludes certain significant shootings in Canada. And these particular shootings need to be included and examined for a variety of reasons if we're really going to look at this honestly. And by the way, we're not going to say the names of any of the perpetrators. Multiple victim public shootings don't happen very often in Canada. In fact, there have been between 9 and 17 of these events since 1967, again, depending on how you define them. Also, keep in mind an estimated 86 Canadians have been killed in mass shootings over the last 55 years. Again, these were all innocent people who didn't deserve to become victims of these terrible crimes. The worst mass shooting in Canadian history was at École Polytechnique in Montreal in 1989. In roughly 20 minutes, 28 people were shot, 1 stabbed, and 14 of them died. It was one of the darkest days in Canadian history. The police that arrived on scene waited outside and set up containment. No one entered until long after the perpetrator shot himself. He had ammunition and ample time left to do even more damage. Thankfully, he didn't have that chance. It's common for these perpetrators to kill themselves at the end of their rampages or plan to be killed by police at some point. The shooting at École Polytechnique inspired Canada's steady march towards more gun control. The idea, of course, is that if guns were more difficult to get, there would be fewer mass killings. In the aftermath at Polytechnique, much of the focus on this crime was on the firearm used. Gun control advocates called it an assault rifle, and to this day claim that nobody needs a gun like that. Objective observers and gun owners claim that crimes like these have everything to do with the motivation of the killer. However, to be fair, does the type of gun make a difference? In Shell Lake, Saskatchewan in 1967, a paranoid schizophrenic randomly killed a family of 9 people, leaving 1 survivor using a .22 caliber rifle. This firearm was not an assault rifle. In 1975, in Brampton, Ontario, Canada had its first school shooting, where a 16-year-old student killed 2 and wounded 13 using a lever-action rifle and a .22. These firearms were not assault rifles either. The Edmonton shooting in 2012 was committed with a handgun. The perpetrator killed 9 people. The evidence does not support the idea that the type of firearm has a significant bearing on the number of people killed in these events or making a mass attack more likely to happen. In Dr. Teresa Sauer's coroner report on the events at Polytechnique, she made some conclusions about the firearm used. The issue of firearms control has intentionally not been addressed. With the unlimited ammunition and the time that the shooter had available to him, he would probably have been able to achieve similar results even with a conventional hunting weapon, which itself is readily accessible. Despite the constant debates about firearms, some of Canada's worst attacks were committed without firearms. In 1972, using a couple of dollars worth of gasoline, 37 people were killed and 64 injured in the Montreal nightclub arson attack. 3 men attacked the nightclub because they were refused entry as they were too intoxicated. In the case of the Toronto van attack, we don't even know if the perpetrator bothered to look into getting a firearms license or obtaining a firearm. He simply needed a valid credit card and $80 to rent a van for a day. He was able to kill 10 unsuspecting and innocent Canadians and injure 16 more. If a firearm were used, this would have been the 3rd largest mass shooting in Canadian history. So if not the type of gun, what are the factors that determine how effective a multiple victim public shooting is? What we know, looking at every such shooting in Canada, is that it comes down to the level of planning the perpetrator does, the level of confinement the victims are subject to, the police response, though that only applies when the shooting continues for an extended period, and finally, whether or not anyone at the scene is able to intervene in any effective way. Many in law enforcement know that mass killings are a reality no matter how they're carried out, and they've evolved the way that they respond to these events. Many agencies no longer wait to enter buildings while these things are happening. Once more than one officer shows up, they form a team and enter. It seems they've come to a conclusion about the only way to stop these shootings. It's to get more guns into the building. Of course, that flies in the face of the mantra, more guns equal more death. Now, you might say that when it comes to mass shootings, more guns equal less death. There's no doubt that there are people watching this right now who are thinking, well, that sounds like a gun lobby talking point. But there's no way around it. It's physically true. So have we seen examples of this in Canada? Yes, we have. And we'll take an honest look at them when we come back. In 2006, there was another school shooting in Montreal at Dawson College. This event was very different than the one at École Polytechnique. This perpetrator had multiple weapons and a substantial supply of ammunition. One young promising student was killed and 19 others were injured. At Polytechnique, the shooter had one rifle and a hunting knife. 28 people were shot and 14 died. Why were the outcomes so different? The first observation is that much of the shooting at Dawson College occurred outside and then in a cafeteria. At Polytechnique, the perpetrator engaged many of the victims in confined areas such as classrooms and hallways. But most significantly, in the shooting at École Polytechnique, the perpetrator had complete control of the crime scene until he himself decided his rampage was over. In contrast, when the shooting at Dawson College started, 2 Montreal policemen happened to be on scene for another matter and ran toward the sound of the gunfire. Officer Denis Cote was able to place a shot that struck the shooter in the arm. The perpetrator subsequently committed suicide with the handgun he had brought with him. One can only imagine how long this shooting would have gone on if someone with a gun hadn't been there to intervene. And thankfully, these 2 officers put themselves at deadly risk and didn't simply set up containment and wait for backup. No one knows how many lives were saved as a result. The shocking 2014 Parliament Hill shooting provides another interesting example. The perpetrator used a lever-action hunting rifle. The shooter was able to run all over downtown Ottawa into the Parliament building, killing 1 and injuring 3. How did this shooting end? Multiple people with firearms were able to pin down the killer and neutralize him. Imagine if no one in the Parliament had a gun. And how did the Canadian government react to this shooting, by the way? Every PPS officer now carries a gun, where they didn't before. They increased the number of guns on Parliament Hill by, who knows, 20 times? For many people, these are incredibly painful memories. But if we truly want to save lives, then we need to examine these events and try to figure out what we can learn from them. In jurisdictions where people can protect themselves with firearms, we see similar outcomes to this. On December 9, 2007, at around midnight, a man armed with a rifle and 2 handguns shot 4 people at a youth missionary in Arvada, Colorado, killing 2 of them. At around 1 p.m. the same day, he showed up at the New Life Church in Colorado Springs. According to the New Life Church, there were roughly 7,000 people on the property at the time. The shooting started when the perpetrator shot another 4 people in the parking lot, again killing 2 of them. He then made his way into the church foyer and shot another person. At this point, this man was in a position to commit the largest mass shooting in U.S. history. However, before he got more than 15 feet inside the building, he was shot multiple times by Jean Assam, who had volunteered to work security at the church. She was a legal gun owner. And thankfully, Colorado allows citizens to carry firearms for the purpose of protection. The church's pastor, Brady Boyd, believes Assam saved over 100 lives that day. 7,000 people in a confined area? I think it's very reasonable to think that she saved many more than that. Another example occurred in Panama City, Florida in 2010. A distraught man stood up at a school board meeting and spray painted a V on the wall. He then pulled out a handgun and declared, among other things, that he was going to die today. He suffered from bipolar disorder and was motivated by his wife losing her job as a school bus driver, therefore losing her pay and her benefits. The man ordered everyone out of the room except the members of the board and made clear his intent was to kill everyone in the room, including himself. After a brief exchange with one of the board members, he opened fire. But just after the first shot, school security officer Mike Jones engaged him with several rounds, causing the perpetrator to fall to the ground and immediately commit suicide. Just like in Colorado, Florida has strong concealed carry laws that allowed Mike Jones to carry even on school property. A minimum of 6 lives were saved that day, important lives. There are numerous other examples, including the shooting at the West Freeway Church in Texas in 2019, where church security volunteer Jack Wilson acted in seconds to stop a man who opened fire with a pump-action shotgun during Sunday services. 2 congregation members died, but Jack Wilson, another armed church volunteer, saved countless others, important lives. From the first shot to the last, this particular incident was over in 6 seconds. 6 seconds. Imagine for a moment that the shooting at Polytechnic was over in 6 seconds. To be fair, it's not a perfect analogy, but just entertain the thought just for a minute. Many of those young women would be alive today, and many more wouldn't have been injured. As I mentioned in episode 3, the purpose of this discussion is not to sell the idea of concealed carry to Canadians. There's a clear case for it. There's no dispute that it saves lives. There's a lot of data on it. We talked about all that in episode 3. But what we are talking about here are the realities of multiple victim public shootings. Gun control advocates use these kinds of events to promote gun bans. And you know what? It's effective. Because no living, feeling human being wants to see these things happen, much less be a part in letting them happen more easily. But the reality is that a mass shooting can be effectively carried out with any kind of firearm, from a .22 to a handgun to a semi-auto rifle or a pump-action shotgun. There are over 1 billion firearms in circulation in the world today, 20 million in Canada alone. The supply of firearms is not drying up anytime soon. A ban on so-called military assault weapons is a distraction. It's a political game. It won't stop people from committing mass attacks with or without firearms. When we come back, we'll wrap up this final episode of Gun Ban Canada Exposed. Stay with us.